Hello, LordImmolation. Pyro here. So yeah, it is Pyro, not Pyro, but I'm fine with Pyro. So yeah, okay. Well, I think that the main thing to focus in on is this issue about pure reason. Okay. I'm not familiar, and I tried to look it up and did not find this distinction between enduralist and peduralist. I think you're probably correct that I believe in, I can see the root words in this things that endure, and perhaps fits my description of the definition of river that I want. Though I want to say that that's not how I'm perceiving it, is not that I'm saying that my belief in the nature of things is such that we have to define river that way. It's really just more practical. I believe we invent terms, and when we find we've invented a term and the intentional meaning of that term is something that we that like applies to nothing, that term is probably not, that definition is probably not a really good candidate anymore for that term. We need a definition that can actually grapple with reality. So if we say that you can never return to the same river twice, then you can never say hello to the same person twice, or pick up the same cup twice, or for that matter, when I pick the cup up, it's different than when I put it down. And every second it's different. Meaning there's no use to the word river or the word same or any word when it comes to identity. So so we can't use the words to refer to things, and that's just not a very useful definition. Whereas if we assume that our descriptions are identifying labels applied to systems and dynamic things, then suddenly those words can work again. So that's the point of that. But in terms of pure reason, the problem I have with pure reason is that we need a mind to reason. And as far as I can tell, the mind is a perceptual processor. It needs perceptions. If a human mind was in a black void with no perceptions, I don't believe it would be able to reason. And if it had its internal perceptions for some reason sparked up so that it could have dreams of things, I think it's fairly likely that those would be undifferentiated patterns. But assuming that you could react just to your own internal, let's say you lost your senses later in life, so you already understood the spatial and other structures of your sense spaces, and so you could dream in terms of those. Then you'd still have perceptions that you'd be reacting to. You'd create diagrams. I mean, when you're talking about these things of pure reason, we're using words and symbols, and all of these things require perceptions, because our brain to think has to be stimulated by perception. So pure reason, to me, requires perception, because if I were to take anything as a metaphysics, it's my starting point of reason, which is that we get perceptions. We define ourselves as a thing getting perceptions, that our passive subject self, the one that's receiving the perceptions. That could be the metaphysics, because it really is. It does underlie every physical claim that I would make, is that we receive the perceptions. But I don't see it as metaphysical, because that's all based on the fact that this mind is a material thing. It's part of a materialist model. It's interesting that you wonder if the world exists, if there's any intrinsic properties, and yet you do still want to say there was an external world before we existed. Now, I would say there is a world, there is a material world. I don't think you can use the word external at this point, but I believe there's a material world, not before it's interacted with, though. So we have to deal with this difficult issue of this similarity and also differences between interaction between two systems and perception of that interaction. So in other words, our physical system can interact with something. Well, we just have particular interactions that we can detect that we have interacted. But with the external world, how would you define an external world? You say an external world exists, but the word external is relative to a reference frame, right? External to your internal, to you, your subjective internal. So it's relative to you. So if the external world is defined relative to you, how could it exist without you? That external world has to be relative to something, right? So this is also a hint as to, well, how do I define the external world? Well, I do it entirely in terms of the external world is related to certain perceptions I receive. And my conception of them as external is really more of a conception of them not being under my direct control or indirect control or control at all or whatever. They're not under my control. And this subset is related to an inner subjectivity. By the time I start thinking of externality, I've accepted that other things have subjective points of view. So in general, I will have accepted the external reality, meaning the not controlled by me, perceptions not controlled by me, associated with phenomena, and I will say that that phenomena is generating those actions that I'm perceiving. And it is then the connecting space between us which constitutes the external world. I think because, again, we're animals, and my starting point is animalistic, organic type of a system. I would say a materialism, but as I say that, I have to explain the materialism in my subjective definitions. But we tend to anthropomorphize even inanimate objects. So we grant, so in other words, we can imagine a subjective point of view of, say, a stone, sitting where the stone looks and stuff. But they don't actually have intentionality, so the language gets a little messy to talk about those as subjects. And really, I think if we only had inanimate objects, it would be around us. It'd be much easier to be a solipsist, a more reasonable conclusion than it is, given that there are other subjective beings out there, that intentional beings that provide us with a concept of other subjective spaces. So when we say that there's another subjective space, we're granting there's another internal space, and again, the external space is really just is combinatorial of all the subjective spaces. So objectivity is really an intersubjective thing. And I don't mean that in sense of a consensus reality. I mean that in the sense of relativism, that there are no intrinsic properties. The properties occur with relation to other things. So what we think of as an objective external material world is really a relativistic intersubjective, or if you want to call these things objects, interobjective. It's the external world is these interactions between these entities, and if one entity could never interact with another, if they're further than the light speed distances necessary to separate them for all time, then they don't exist for each other. Okay, so you can't just say, oh, there's an external world that exists. No, it has to do with what you're going to interact with.